I think it's about soft power. It's about the power of us as people. And when we look at these enormous institutions, the trouble with our political systems and the corporations that we may be up against, or how media is spiraling out of control, it looks like such a powerful and inordinate challenge. What we have to offer is so much softer. We have our voices and we have each other and we have our collective votes. And I think it's what we should focus on.
Hello, and welcome to Earth Rising, a podcast about connecting to our planet through the arts, spirituality, and conservation. I'm your host, Erin Haley, and in this episode, we'll be hearing from Dr. Ellis Jones. Ellis is a sociologist and professor at College of the Holy Cross, who focuses on social responsibility, global citizenship, and everyday activism, with an emphasis on how to turn environmental idealism into practical action. Ellis has created BetterWorldShopper.org and the Better World shopping guides and apps that focus on how to approach consumerism in a more environmentally conscious manner. In this episode, we explore how to hold power accountable, the path of reclaiming our collective voice in society, and the move toward global citizenship, all with an eye on creating a more sustainable and environmentally just planet. Good morning, Ellis. I just wanted to thank you, first of all, for taking the time to have this conversation. I think it's going to be really illuminating. And to get started, it would be great just to hear a little bit about your background as a sociologist, a professor, and if you could go into some of your influences and personal journey that have led you to this point in your life.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just say it's such a pleasure to be on this podcast, Erin. I really appreciate the opportunity. I think I'll start. Part of my journey was being inspired as an undergraduate. At USC, I came across a book called How to Make the World a Better Place, and by Jeffrey Hollander, the guy who founded Seventh Generation. And it just seemed so inspiring. It was all about how an individual can make a difference in the world. And I thought, he's on to something here. And he doesn't make it issue specific. And I was reading this in the context of Earth Day 1990, and I was so inspired to be at a little fair next to the college, USC, in LA. I was at this little Earth Day fair and I saw these environmentalists doing all this amazing stuff where they were translating activism and social change into something that individuals could participate in one by one, that you didn't have to be part of a group or an organization or go to meetings. You could just, recycle here and buy something there and do your part, really do your piece as an individual. And I thought, this is a revolution. This is a revolution for social change and social movements. And what's going to happen is every other social movement is going to see what the environmentalists are doing, and they're going to say, look, we need this for our social movement, whether it's social justice or human rights or anything else. And of course, that's not what happened. And I kept thinking, well, somebody's going to write this book and it'll be all about taking all of our issues and creating individual access points, kind of a democratization for change for everyone. And it didn't happen. And then 10 years later, I finally decided in graduate school, when I was studying sociology, to avoid my dissertation by trying to write this book. And I had my advisor at the time who was at first intrigued and said, yeah, definitely bring in your ideas. I'd love to hear about it. And he read through the little scraps of notes that I had. And he came back and we had a meeting and he said, this is a terrible idea. You should not pursue this. And I was so mad. I was so absolutely furious with my advisor that I knew at that point that I was going to do it no matter what. Having said that, I couldn't actually write the first book. This is about the Better World Handbook. I couldn't write without the help of friends. So I actually roped in a couple of friends and they loved the idea. They loved it so much they became co-authors with me. And we wrote the Better World Handbook, and it was published in 2001. And that was that book that I've been waiting for someone else to write about how an individual can access personally the ability to participate in the solutions around the whole range of global problems, like climate change. At the time, we called it global warming, and social justice issues around the world, and human rights and animal protection and communities and everything. And this was that manual. And in part, what excited my colleagues, other graduate students at the time, was that we were all teaching these social problems classes in sociology, and we were depressing the heck out of our students, right? Because they come to this class and then we reveal like all the structural racism and the patriarchal nature of the society and all of this stuff. And they're just overwhelmed because they've never heard of it before. And then they all ask, what can we do? And we didn't have an answer, a good one. And so this book became that answer, right? It was what you can do.
Oh, I love that. And I'm curious, in researching you, one of the concepts that I came across that I hadn't heard of before is the sociological imagination. I would love to hear about where this handbook, where does that fit into this concept? And if you could just break down for us what that is, where that idea comes from, and how it interrelates into all of this in terms of all of us becoming like better stewards of the planet.
Sure, this is a great concept. In fact, it is considered, they did a poll maybe a decade ago of all the sociologists that were teaching introductory sociology courses. What is the one thing that you want students to take away from your intro to sociology course? And the number one concept was the sociological imagination. And it's a wonderful concept. It comes from C. Wright Mills, who at the time was considered a complete outcast in sociology. His work was not well regarded. People marginalized him. So with the sociological imagination, what Mills was trying to say was that we as individuals, we process things through such an individual framework that everything to us is a biography. It's like we're walking through our lives as if we are going to write a book about ourselves and then retell the story. But in fact, our lives are not these isolated biography pods. They're in fact interconnected, and they're connected through something called history, which is what we share socially. So he wants us to look at the connection or the nexus between biography and history, what he would often call the personal and the social. And what he's saying is that if one person is unemployed in a society, that's their problem. That's a biographical problem. But when you have an unemployment rate of, 2% or 5% or 10%, like suddenly that's a social problem. You experience it as biography, but in fact, it's a part of history. And this moment is so perfect for that in the pandemic, because suddenly we realize history comes to the fore. And while we may have our own biographies, we can't live them out quite the way we planned because of this historical moment that we're living in. But the reality is that's happening every day. We just don't experience it because our frameworks are so limited. So what he's saying to us, Mills, with the sociological imagination, is that our brains are just too limited for us to experience reality. And the only thing that will save us is literally the thing that we ignore, which is our ability to imagine. So we're often using our imagination to imagine unicorns or dragons or whatever fantasy we want. That's how we utilize it. But what Mills is saying is that you have to use your imagination to imagine reality, because our little brains on an everyday basis can't imagine it. But the reality is, like when you are unemployed in, for example, a pandemic, it is not your fault. It is not about you. It is about the fact that a bunch of people became unemployed suddenly because of the pandemic. And so this happens over and over again, but we always experience it personally when in fact, it is a public issue. And the more we can wrap our heads around this idea that these things that we experience are just these tiny indicators of what we are all experiencing at some level, then we can begin to re-engage the society in the way that we should, which is through this sociological imagination, through this understanding that we are a social group that needs to move forward in this collective way so that we can solve these problems that cannot be solved by individuals.
Wow. So it really comes down to understanding the relationship between our individual lives and society as a whole. It seems like it's really getting into just the interconnected nature of things. And there's an essay you wrote, Creating a More Just and Sustainable World. In it, you also talk about having this sociological imagination provides us an opportunity to increase our freedom and expand our options. And that's what I hear you speaking to, is that it's just leveraging an imagination, having our dream space. But it seems to be activating that in a specific way here towards just becoming more empowered in society.
Exactly, because we don't realize what power we have socially. One of the critiques, I think, in general, of this focus that I have taken on for a long time, which is a focus on how individuals can help create change, is that, look, we're not individuals and you can't create change as individuals. You create change socially. And I completely agree. And yet I still think that it's important to access individuals because we need to take everybody sort of one at a time and walk them through this idea that, look, when you don't understand your relationship with the society, when you don't understand our collective power, you actually disempower yourself and we disempower ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I always come back to the idea of democracy. So democracy has a fundamental contradiction at its core, and that is that in any given election, particularly in this country, your personal individual vote is almost meaningless. Mathematically speaking, it almost doesn't matter at all. There's just so little chance that a single vote will throw an election. So it's about collective voting. And so on the one hand, it doesn't matter at all. And then on the other hand, the only thing that matters in a democracy is how many people vote. It's the only thing that matters. Yeah. Without voters, without people voting, you don't have a democracy. You end up with a system that is just determined by a handful of people that show up, or just the one person that decides to cast the vote and nobody else is voting. So if everybody played it out logically, the democracy would crumble. And the democracy is only as healthy as the participation. So a weak democracy has like 50% participation, and a strong democracy has like 90% participation, right? Because then the voices of 90% of the people are being heard. And this is the same contradiction that we come across, whether it's with ethical consumerism, whether it's with recycling, whether it's with anything. And that is, it's not really about you. You and your practice is helpful, but it's about you being able to shift in to begin to realize that the power is with us. Mm-hmm. The power is you getting your voice heard within all of our voices, so that we begin to realize that our participation is absolutely essential in these various democracies that we have, which are not just the political ones that we wait every 2 and 4 years, but rather that daily we participate in these democratic realms. We just don't realize that we're voting.
Well, and you also present an idea of reclaiming our collective voice as a society, which is what you've been speaking to right now as well. And you said that this has somehow been lost along the way. So I wonder, how does this play into this need to reclaim our collective voice? When do you think it was lost? And how do we reclaim it?
Well, so I think we're suffering from what some scholars would call hyper-individualism. Mm-hmm. And in this country, I think we have it in spades. We may have it worse than anywhere else in the world. And we've gotten so many amazing things from individualism. So don't get me wrong. It's a little bit like too much of a good thing. So because of our individualism, we have like great stories about people and entrepreneurship, and we have creativity, and we just have this, wonderful diversity of expression, and just there's so many great things about individualism. But if it goes too far, things become unbalanced, and there's a sacrifice, which is the more individualism, the less collectivism, the less you are able to process how we as a collective come together if you're so focused on how you as an individual behave. And of course, there are other downsides, like I was mentioning the sociological imagination. While we might personally take credit because we're taught personal responsibility, so when things go well, we take credit personally, but it also means that we take all the blame if things go wrong. And that means, like, if the pandemic shows up, you are unemployed, now you take it personally. You have nowhere else to go because you have no collective imagination, right? You have no collective sense of who you are as a being. And so you take it personally, which leads to isolation. It leads to higher rates of suicide. It leads to all kinds of things that I think we suffer from deeply in the society, and we need to come to terms with, which is much of our suffering is now based on our isolation from each other. And what we need to do is rebuild the fabric where we are connected. And we can see that sometimes in things like, Black Lives Matter protests, or any times we're operating collectively and we see our collective voice come together and make some change or make some kind of difference, then we're coming back and connecting back to those ideas. But I think they have been lost along the way, sort of sacrificed at the altar of individualism. Even in my classes, when we talk about things like personal responsibility, every student knows and has been taught from a very young age how important personal responsibility is. But there's almost no one who ever gets taught social responsibility, right?
Mhm.
That even the word itself is a little bit ambiguous. This idea that we might have some obligation and we might need to participate and have a collective voice and a collective empowerment in society, that has been lost. That has been thrown to the wayside. And we need to circle back to it because, to be honest, the vast majority of the problems that face us in the 21st century are collective problems. They're not individual. So they're part of what I often use to illustrate them is the tragedy of the commons, this concept by Garrett Hardin, where he illustrates this very silly story in which shepherds are all using this particular hill in the English countryside to graze their sheep on. And one day, one shepherd says, "Oh, I have this great idea. I'm going to get another sheep because if I have another sheep, I'll have a little more wool. I can sell it at the marketplace and maybe get shoes for my kids, or we could be a little better off as a family." And so that shepherd goes out and does that. And there's another sheep and it's great. And the other shepherds are like, "This is great. This guy's an entrepreneur. He's amazing. He's got this great idea. It's really working well for them. So we're all going to do that." So they all get some more sheep. And then they realize, hey, if we have even more sheep, then it's even better. And so they keep getting more and more sheep and things are going great. And then one day, the grass that they've all been grazing on has been chewed down so far to the roots that it doesn't regrow back. And so the grass on the hill dies, and then all the sheep die, and then all the shepherds die. And this tragedy of the commons is about how rational choices made by individuals that are 100% rational for those individuals to make can lead to collective irrational outcomes. And so the examples of this worldwide are things like climate change, where we all are pursuing rationally moving industrialization forward and coming into the 21st century and doing all these things because it helps our society. And yet collectively, it makes absolutely no sense. And we're going to kill ourselves because we're pursuing it so rationally. To get out of a tragedy of the commons problem, there's only one solution, and that is cooperation. And that's why you get things like the Paris Climate Agreement, in which like almost every country in the world comes together, which is unprecedented, to sign this agreement. And the US opts out at the last minute because of President Trump. And now we're opting back in. But these kinds of problems can only be solved through cooperation. And of course, we're terrible at it because we don't have a background. None of our education system and none of our culture rewards us for cooperating. And rather, it rewards us for competition. And again, it's not that competition or individualism is bad. It is only a problem when it becomes so far out of balance with its opposite, which would be the ability to cooperate with each other or the ability to take on social responsibility. As long as those are in balance, then it's wonderful.
I love all the points you bring up in that. And I think this is a really great point in our conversation to loop back around where you started, which is what you've been doing on a personal level, which is one of the main reasons that I wanted to bring you on and talk to you today. At the end of my first season of the podcast, I was getting feedback. And one of the yearnings is that people, they love to hear about concepts and larger scale ideas and frameworks. But it was also this yearning for, well, what can we do on a more practical level, more everyday? And so one of the things you're really offering to the world, and I think this ties into reclaiming our collective voice, but also our individual actions, is that you have created the Better World shopping books. There's a website called betterworldshopper.org. These are here for us to use as practical guides in our everyday shopping choices, where you are rating organizations. And you said you're doing some more recent projects. You have even some mobile apps you've created. So maybe walk us through a little bit about how these practical guides are helping us to address this problem. And it touches on everything we've been talking about, from activating the sociological imagination to seeing more of our collective influence, and that we are more powerful than we think, especially through the money that we spend. So yeah, I would love to hear how you develop that as an answer to some of these.
Yeah. So first of all, I've always wanted to democratize social change. It's a funny way of thinking about it, but one of the things that is an advantage with our democracy is that voting is quite simple on the face of it. I mean, it's very complicated, and actually it's almost impossible to do the right way, not because of us, but because of how the system is set up. But having said that, it's somewhat simple. You know, it happens every couple of years. You show up, you cast your votes, and then you move on. And so my mantras have been, when I want to democratize social change as a way to build a bridge from individuals into this collective imagination, this social responsibility, is you need to meet individuals where they're at. And so my mantras are simple, practical, everyday.
Mm.
Like for years, I had a tradition with my best friend where we would once a year find a spiritual retreat to go on, and it didn't really matter what the tradition was. And one year we went to a Zen center and we spent the whole weekend in silence doing all kinds of funny Zen meditations, and it was wonderful. Anyway, but one of the things I took from that is like, sometimes it is the practicing of the thing that is important. You have to practice each day a little bit, and the practice itself helps you strengthen those muscles and that part of your brain so that it becomes second nature in the long run. So all of this stuff around ethical consumerism, all this Better World Shopping Guide stuff, where I'm essentially giving individuals the ability to practice social and environmental responsibility by looking at these grades for these companies that they purchase from every day and practicing choosing the better companies, the better options, voting for those companies that they want to support, and withholding their money from the companies that are being destructive to our way of life and our planet. This practice is really important for individuals. And so that's my initial reason for putting it out, but it really is only the first step. Most people, again, the critics would say, look, you're having people focus on this sort of armchair activism stuff, and then they feel good about themselves, they pat themselves on the back, and then they go home. Okay, yes, that might happen if it's not done well. But the whole point of it is not to let it stand with the individual. The individual is like in this daily Zen practice of trying to do better with their shopping and be conscious about where their money is going so that they can realize that their money is another form of their voice. Their economic voice is as powerful, if not more powerful, than their political voice. And the practicing of this daily understanding of what their economic voice is helps them contribute to this sort of budding economic democracy. And in that way, what we do is we open the door to, hey, how is my workplace spending its money? Hey, how is the school that I'm at spending their money? How is my state and local government spending their money? And could there be decisions made at these levels that then have even more impact than any individual? So it starts with that economic voice and expands from the individual to things like workplace and governments and schools and so forth, so that we can start collectively saying, here is who we are, here's what we're about, and here's the better world we're going to build, economically speaking, politically speaking. And yet, I mentioned that I think on the one hand, voting is simple and then it's super complicated. I've always found this. I've been voting ever since I'm 18 and I still can't wrap my head around the ballot.
I know. It's so true.
And it's the system. The one thing I enjoy about this, my background originally as an undergraduate was international relations, which is just essentially an international version of political science. So I consider myself a poli-sci major way back when. I didn't get that much out of it, but one of the things that I took away was how the things that I am studying now in the economic sphere around rating corporations and all the things they do and trying to get a comprehensive picture using publicly available data boiled down into a database that like looks at 30 or 40 years worth of data and makes sense of it and turns it into simple A through F ratings. When I come up with a problem that it's difficult to get beyond in the economic sphere, I always harken back to the political sphere because we're talking about similar things. We're talking about trying to have collective voices that are effective and clear. We're trying to talk about building democracies. And so one of the things I found as I worked on trying to help people understand and wield their economic voices with this shopping guide stuff and rating corporations and keeping those institutions of power accountable for their behavior is that I started circling back to how difficult it is for us to do that in our political sphere. And we're suffering from the same issues. So in the political sphere, most people have this sense that politicians are not telling the truth very much. And this is a problem. But this is the same in the economic sphere. We call greenwashing. And it's when all of these companies come out and they say they're doing amazing things and all they need is your help by buying their products and they're going to save the world for you. And it's not true. The vast majority of that is just false. It's just lies. And so out of this early shopping stuff that I still work on to this day has come these other projects that I've been turning into apps that you've mentioned now. And at the moment, I call them the glass projects. So trying to see things clearly as through glass for transparency. The first one is called Voter Glass, and it's when my students got interested in this idea of which of our politicians are telling the truth and which are lying. It's a very basic, I think, fundamental question. It's not particularly partisan at its most basic level, which is people want politicians who will tell them the truth most of the time, because nobody wants to be lied to. Nobody wants to be fooled. People want to hear what that politician is for, and they may be for or against it, but they would like to know the truth. I think many people would agree with that despite their political persuasion. So what I did was took PolitiFact data, which is the largest database we have on the public fact checking of politicians and their statements. I took all of that over the past 15 years and I turned it into simple, practical, everyday. I turned it into A to F grades for honesty. And these honesty report cards are now generated for every representative, every senator, every governor, every presidential administration in the last 5 or 10 years. And they're there for people to access. It's not the be all end all, but these honesty ratings will give people one more thing to work with. And there are politicians who get A's, and there are politicians who get F's, and there are politicians who get the only grade lower than an F, which is an X, which is the people who are so, I always say, there's a difference between a student who fails your class because they got like a 51% and the student who got 2% in the whole class. Like there has to be a distinction. We leave it at F, right? At 59% and lower, but there's such a distinction for somebody who tried really hard and blew it versus somebody who doesn't even care about the whole thing and is just trying to undermine the system. And that's an X. And I use it now for corporations as well. There are certain corporations, there are certain politicians who are so deeply embedded in the lie that they're undermining the system itself. And those need to be pointed out. And then there are other politicians who are trying hard to, and other corporations who are trying hard to do the right thing. Now, they're not always successful, but they are trying, and they need to be pointed out so that people can see that there are people that you could still believe in at some level. And then this last year, I started the media version of this called Media Glass. And it was based on this idea that people don't know who to trust anymore. They don't know what news source to trust and what not to trust. And so I began to collect data that are now tracking both the integrity of media. So there are two scales. There is truth versus fiction, and there's left versus right versus middle. And so what this app does is it takes all of that available data and it turns it into practical, simple, everyday A to F grades for each of these media outlets that people can utilize. And by having this ability to navigate these very complicated systems, we now have a better chance at just getting the basics down so that we can become better political citizens, we can become better economic citizens, and we can become better information citizens.
And is this something, this sounds really helpful, is this something that you're doing mainly in the US? And if so, do you have plans? I mean, I know it's a extraordinary undertaking, but would you be interested in looking at this on an international scale at some point in terms of helping people with voting choices, media choices?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to do all of this stuff. There's two directions to go. My shopping guide work, that economic voice work, has always been sort of targeted specifically at the national level. So it's mostly US, although it has relevance for people in other countries because many of these brands and these companies are international, and so they can recognize those labels. Now, it also has relevance to people, locally in cities and in towns and communities. However, what would be more relevant, of course, would be this kind of data that was tailored to a city, or a little community, or even state by state. And at the other level, it would be useful if there was a version for Canada and a version for Mexico and a version for the UK, and maybe even a global version. I have worked here in Worcester, Massachusetts for a while on a little local guide with my students, which is tricky to navigate and I think is a whole project unto itself, but there needs to be a template created so that people can take this on locally and generate these guides that are much more locally relevant to the city that, for example, that they live in, or even the state. And the same thing at the international level. The same is true for the political voice stuff, which would be even better if it was local at state and local levels, as well as for other countries, as well as the media stuff. Now, the media stuff is a little more relevant and it plays in some of these places at the same time. I think there are maybe 300 or so media sources listed, and some of those are international media outlets. Some of them are national. Some of them are regional, so like regional newspapers, et cetera, or even radio stations. But you're right. If we're going to make a real effort of expanding our democracy in these areas, we need to be able to tailor them at the micro level, the local and state level, as well as at the international level.
Well, and also what I like that, at least with your shopping guides, that you base the scores in various areas. I read that for the shopping books that you had a comprehensive database of over 2,000 companies and 76 reliable sources of data, and that the scores are in 5 areas, including human rights, which could be sweatshops, child labor. Second is the environment. So it's looking at global warming, rainforest destruction, then also animal protection. So animal testing, humane treatment of animals, community involvement, which can be anything from like nonprofit alliances and local business support. And then you also look at social justice, so how workers are treated, wages discrimination. So one of the things that's worth noting here is that as you're going through and at least rating corporations, and I'm sure it's also extending into how you look at the media, is just that you're really considering how do you thoroughly research and vet sources so that you can direct people in a way that is going to be honest and helpful.
Yeah, so my approach has always been, instead of to dive into individual issues and provide the environmental people with their environmental data and then provide the human rights people with the human rights data, was to stop siloing these efforts. I really believe in efforts like environmental justice, which combines structural racism with environmental issues. That kind of stuff we need more of. We need to see how all of these issues overlap, because I believe all of these things are linked and you cannot separate them out. They must all happen together. You can't have a super environmental society if it's completely socially unjust. It just doesn't work. You have to have these packages all together. And the funny thing is, on the one hand, I always thought this was sort of my own lens. I was trying to be very thoughtful about it. But it turns out in the last few years, I've been doing more research about these kinds of projects internationally. And so there's a major project that's even older than mine out of the UK called Ethical Consumer. There's something out of Australia called Shop Ethical. There are all kinds of projects like this all over the world. And the one thing they share in common is they all do the same thing that I do, which is they look at these comprehensive issues. They put them all under the same tent. And I thought, well, maybe my tent is very American and these other tents are going to be very different. They're not.
Wow.
They really are all looking at the same set of issues, these same categories. I wrote a whole article in an academic journal and published it based on this idea of trying to compare and see what the differences are. And it was just mind-blowing to me that what we have, I think, is a budding global understanding of these comprehensive issues that are out there that we have to tackle together.
Yes.
And it's very inspiring for me to see that I wasn't out there in the wilderness by myself, that this was actually, unbeknownst to me, part of a collective effort globally by many people in many countries to take on these issues. And they do things, they integrate the political influence of corporations and their human rights records and their records on climate change. But the other thing to note is that when you're looking at corporations and what they do, the vast majority of data that exists is hidden. It is just not available. They're not forced to make it available. There's almost no transparency laws. And so what happens is you just get these little crumbs of data all over the place. And there's just not quite enough crumbs for you to make a kind of credible statement about this one area alone. This is how the corporations are doing, or this one area alone. Here's all the great data, because there isn't great data. But if you pull all those crumbs together, you get a really clear picture of what's happening. And that's what we do. I think collectively we've been doing with these projects around the world, is trying to get the big picture based on these very small bits of data, which are hard to find, hard to analyze, hard to make sure that they are reliable rather than another version of spin over here or there. And once you pull that together, the pictures become more crystal clear than they have been.
Well, first of all, it's very encouraging that you found that the same thing was happening in the UK and Australia with older projects, that they were taking this comprehensive approach. That must have been really validating. And
Yeah.
I wondered about that too. I think we all know as consumers, it's frustrating because corporations are not transparent, and the media and politicians. But just back to corporations, it sounds like this is really the most effective way that we can get past greenwashing as well, is by taking as holistic, like bird's eye view as we possibly can. That's basically
It really is the name of the game. If we can get past the greenwashing, which dominates the corporate space and thus dominates the consumer space, then we can actually start to make real decisions. And these companies have spent a long time sort of playing and getting good at this greenwashing stuff. So much so that if you're not greenwashing, you may be losing market share. And so this becomes a kind of arms race, right? Very much like the political sphere. If you're not lying a little bit, if you're not sort of revving people up emotionally, even if it's not 100% true, then you might be losing elections. And so these kinds of dynamics are what we have to get into and dismantle. And the only way we do that is with hard data. And this is the other thing that I am absolutely a stickler for. And that is I take no data from the companies themselves. I absolutely will not take data from them because they have no idea what they're talking about. They're caught up in their own spin. They're drinking their own Kool-Aid. And so I cannot take data. So there's a firewall with that. The other thing is that if I have just a few pointers for people out there navigating, first of all, the thing that really gets my goat the most is when you hear people in this realm saying, well, it's important to be a smart consumer. And so my first piece of advice is do your homework, do your own research and figure out what the companies are good or bad. And I just feel like, are you kidding me? I've been doing this research for 30 years. It's like my lifetime, goal is to do this research. And I still have trouble wrapping my head around it. So if you're telling other people to go, quote unquote, do their homework, you're asking them to jump into a gladiator pit, naked and expect to come out alive. You can't do it. Right? You can't do it. You need help and we need to help each other. And so by assembling this data in a way that makes sense. And so the other thing that I'm a real stickler for is for actions and impacts and behavior. Yeah. So what we have to watch out for is commitment or motive or intention. So what happens is all of these companies will come out and they'll say, such and such a company, we're committed to perfect sustainability in 5 years, or they'll make some amazing commitment. And of course, they'll never follow through with it because 5 years, people have forgotten about it. And this happens over and over again. And so there's all this lofty talk and these intentions and motivations. And we here at ExxonMobil are committed to a solar future with renewable energy, whatever it is. And it's just all spin. Yeah. And my question always comes back to, are you showing me data of real things that are happening on the ground? Because that is what I'm measuring and that's what people care about. They don't care about how many promises you make as a politician. They care about how many promises you've kept with actions on the ground. And that's the same with corporations. You can't get caught up in the talk. You also can't get caught up in the eccentricity of the CEOs. I feel like we should write them off altogether. Yes. They're different than the company and they're different than the company's impacts. And the other thing to watch out for, if I can give anybody a tip, that is that you have to be absolutely so careful about philanthropy. And it's not that when a company gives away money to a worthy organization to save the tigers or to fight cancer for children or whatever, that it's a bad thing. It's not. It's helpful and it actually has real impacts, but it's a distraction. It's totally separate from the company doing real things with their supply chain, doing real things for the environment in their daily impacts on this world and with their workers and the communities that they're in. It's a totally different ballgame. And what's happened is these companies have become so large that they can throw around millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars sometimes at worthy causes. And so it feels like they're doing good. And in fact, it's a complete distraction. It doesn't mean anything. It's not that they're doing good or bad. It just means that we shouldn't be looking over there because it's being used in many cases to distract us.
Well, and I think this is a really good point to bring up your documentary that is called Every Dollar is a Vote. And this is actually how I discovered you is from this year's Colorado Environmental Film Festival. And it showcased this documentary. And then also you did a really great Lunch and Learn webinar speaking to a lot of these things. What was a huge eye-opener that you talk about was you speak of a shift where corporations are now actually ranking as being more powerful than entire countries. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this, what parameters factor into how powerful they've become, how you figured this out. And then I keep going back to the international focus because I think, how can we work together if we're discovering now that corporations are more powerful than unique countries? How do we start to need to evolve or continue to evolve as a global society and truly global citizens, understanding this kind of power structure?
Well, it's really important. When I think about my work writ large, It has always been focused, if one part of it has been focused on democratizing social change, the other part is really focused on keeping power accountable.
Yeah.
And I've always thought of that old adage about how power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And solution for that is to disperse power, to make sure it doesn't concentrate, to give it to as many people and to get it as many hands as possible so that it just can't collect in a space. And so what we've been seeing is that in the corporate sphere, the economic sphere, that power has been collecting, and it's not easy to measure. It's actually quite difficult to measure. And there are at least two major approaches to measuring power when you're comparing nation states to corporations to try to get a sense of relative power. And the only thing that these approaches really have in common is that they share a unit of analysis, which in our case would be dollars, right? It's looking at money. And we know at some very basic level that money is power. And that if you have a lot of money in this world, you have a lot of power. And if you don't have any money, then you don't have any power. So we understand there's this direct, fairly clean measure of power on this planet by looking at just dollars or money in terms of dollars. So a couple of ways to measure it. It's usually measured by comparing gross national product or gross domestic product, which is how much money circulates within an economy. And it's the major way we rank countries and look at how powerful they are on this planet is by ranking them based on their GDP or their GNP. And so all the ones that get in the top sort of 10 or so, they end up at these like G8 summits and G12 summits and G20 summits because they have the most powerful economies ranked by their GNP or GDP. These are the power players on the planet. They help decide everything else for everybody else on the planet because they are considered the biggest kids on the block. So that is a given in international relations, that the ones with little voice on this planet are the countries that have very tiny GNPs or GDPs. So they don't really show up on the radar. And so they don't get much of a voice in the UN. They don't end up on the Security Council and all of those things. And then for the economic rating of corporations, they don't have their own GNPs or GDPs. So we look at net revenues and profits. So how much money are they generating and how much money is flowing through them? Because it's similar to how much money is flowing through the economy of a nation state. Sometimes people look at and shift this slightly and they talk about tax revenues for companies. I've seen this kind of comparison where for tax revenues for countries, to compare that to revenues taken in for products and services by companies. But anyway, I usually stick with GDP versus net revenue. And if you compare these two things, and again, they're a little bit of apple and oranges analysis. They overlap in some ways, and so they're not perfect. They're not a perfect apple to an apple comparison. But over time, you can start to see things shift. And what we find is if you just line them all up in the top 100, you get a majority of the 100 most powerful economic entities on the planet. The majority are now corporations. They're not nation states. And this is comparing how much money essentially flows through those economies versus how much money is flowing through the economy, quote unquote, of a corporation. And so you end up with the US is always number one because we have the most powerful economy on the world. And then China is always number two. And then we get like the European Union and Japan and all of these places. And then pretty soon you get down to, I think it's 12, although it may have gone up ever since the last time I looked at it. Number 12 is Walmart. And it's above Sweden. Yeah, Sweden is a country with real people, right? And Walmart, and so the idea is that, well, if Walmart declared itself a country or a nation state tomorrow, that they would be almost in the top 10 of the most powerful countries in the world. They would be sitting on the Security Council. They'd be going to the G20, and it gives us a sense of how power has accumulated so quickly in the sphere. But we don't have anything like democracies that we expect companies to participate in, right? We have this whole idea of democracy to keep power accountable in the political sphere. And we don't have an idea like that for the economic sphere. We're just like, oh, well, those are companies, so it doesn't matter. And now we see the power moving or shifting away from nation states, at least economic power, to these multinational corporations. And yet we have no mechanism. We have no mechanism for keeping that power accountable. And if we don't, in the long run, what we should expect to see is what we expect to see in countries, which is countries that lose their democracy, the power accumulates at the top, and pretty soon you get these corrupt kind of dictatorships, and you get these societies that are just wrecks. And so if we don't keep power accountable in this economic realm, we shouldn't be surprised if we end up with these wrecking balls that come and beat down these democratic projects in the nation states that we built up.
It's kind of overwhelming to think about. And like you've already exposed in how you're scoring corporations is that it's so important to be aware of this, first of all, because of the human rights impact, because of the environmental impact, because of the animal rights, community, social justice, all of those factors. And so what is going to be the next phase? I think we are moving through the world as we never have before. We are connected around the globe through our devices, and just we have so many friends and colleagues. And there's so many wonderful things about how our society has become more global, I think, over the past couple generations. But this is, I feel like it's something that's blindsided us, is this concentration of power in the economic sphere and with corporations. I guess I'm just wondering how we're going to keep moving forward. You know who's coming to mind is Elise Boulding. I don't know if you know her. She, since you did your PhD at CU Boulder, she taught there for a long time.
She was the person actually that I wanted to learn under, and I originally signed up for my PhD at Boulder because I saw Elise Boulding's name on the website, and I thought, oh, I definitely have to learn under her. And as soon as I got there, she had already retired. So,
oh yeah, what a phenomenal woman. So she was Norwegian born, but lived in the U.S. for a lot of her life. She was Quaker, so she had a very strong spiritual compass in how she was approaching things. She advocated for a global civic culture, and she was such a visionary. It was like she was predicting things in her writings. And she talks about that in a global civic culture, it's not just comprised of nation states, but that it's really toward a global community of human beings. And she said this is essential in solving the world's crises. And she also spoke of harnessing our imagination and our intuition, of really activating that dream space towards greater problem solving. So obviously, we're not going to solve it in the course of this conversation, but I guess we just have to keep working at it in terms of seeing past our country borders and just working more collectively.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think we do need a global civic culture. I think we already have one. It's just sort of messy and not particularly well shaped at the moment, but we can easily build it. We have the technology now, we have the connection, we have all of these potentials, and I think we can pull it together. I keep thinking too about the principles that I keep in place when I think about things like a global civic culture, and it's this idea of keeping things simple and transparent so that we can achieve accountability or responsibility is, I think fundamental to building this civic culture. So one of the things that comes to mind is when we have elections, we get all caught up in just counting our votes and who can vote and what their votes count. I want to know what the people who can't vote, I want to know how they think, not because their votes count, but because their voice matters to me. So I want to know what children think. I want to know what prisoners who can't vote think. I want to know what immigrants think. I want somebody to tabulate those voices. Yeah. Now, those are not actual votes, but I want to know how the global community thinks. I want to know who the global community would vote for in our next election. I would just like to hear their voices. And I would like to be able to get my voice heard in the election of other countries. Not that it's an actual vote, but that it's hearing from those communities, listening to each other so that we can begin to, understand more about how we operate. And while we may not have direct power to wield, we may be able to let people know where we're at, because I want to know where all these communities that don't have voices in our current political system are at. And I want to know where consumers are at in different parts of the world. And I want to know where media is at in different parts of the world, and people who create media and independent media outlets and so forth, right? I'm interested. And if my voice can help them find their voices and can add to a collective voice, that's exactly what we need to practice.
Well, and then one community of voices that you do have regular access to is that you do have the privilege of being a professor, and you teach at College of the Holy Cross right now. And so I'm just really curious in terms of, along these lines, what are you seeing in your students as you are presenting some of these concepts? What kind of feedback are you getting from them? They're a really important part of life, of heading out into the world and becoming adults and thinking about how they're going to really interface with society. So what are you seeing in their psyches and connecting to the world at large?
So to be honest, in some cases, I always think that I'm probably more popular with my students than I am with other academics. A lot of the stuff that I end up doing is kind of off script. It's not publishing in the highest rated academic journals and getting the prestige that comes with that. I do some of that, but most of my work is based on stuff that is accessible and practical, and that is something that really speaks to students.
Yeah.
Right? They take so many classes in which things are really important knowledge, to be honest, but it's so overwhelming, I think, at times for them, is that they're hungry for something that they can use now. They're hungry for something that they can really wrap their heads around and then take action on. And so when I present them with these apps, which these two latest apps, the Media Glass and the Voter Glass, there's a third app called Eco Report Card that the students also, these are apps that are generated in large part by either ideas that students came up with in the classroom or are continued by their research. And they're really interested in researching because they can see and use the information immediately. And they also know other people are using it immediately. It's not like a research paper that gets shuffled away, they get a grade on it, and then everybody forgets about it,
right,
including the professor and the student. It is something that they participate in, and then they can immediately see it on their phone, and they can use it, and they can share it, and they can say, hey, mom, dad, look, I helped make this app. What do you think? And people can then talk about it, and they can come give the feedback back to class and say, hey, I was talking to some friends and here's what they think about the app. Here's how we might be able to improve it. And so they feel like they're contributing their knowledge to something that's more than just their own personal development and certificate earning in the long run, that they're actually contributing to the public, that it's something they can use themselves. It seems to be addressing a real problem, which is often not being addressed and otherwise they feel overwhelmed by. And so I think the students are hungry for that kind of connection, and using apps is something I think that the students grew up with and they take to it very easily, and it seems very logical.
Well, that is so exciting to hear about these levels of engagement in your students. It makes me feel inspired. And it's really great that you said that, again, it comes back to what you see really lighting them up is focusing on the practical and going back to your mantra of focusing on what is simple, practical, and that you can apply every day. Earlier in our conversation, you spoke about the influence of being on a Zen retreat, and that you came up with this mantra through being in a Zen atmosphere and practicing, because those are definitely main tenets of that body of teaching. So I'm just really curious what role does spirituality play in your approach? Because that's something that, we explore on the podcast as well, is looking at being better stewards of the planet. And one of the lenses that we look through that is spirituality. So I'm just curious how that has influenced you in your approach to creating all of these guides and being a professor and just your life journey.
It's definitely been an interesting one. So I was raised in a very, I think, contemporary tradition at the time, which was sort of holiday Christian light in California, so to speak. So it was like you show up for Easter, you show up for the Mass at Christmas, on very specific holidays. And then every now and then you actually attend church, but you don't attend the ones that are reading literally from the Bible. You go to these ones that are kind of Christian, but with sort of a mix of some readings from some other traditions, maybe a few extra hugs, and a little more kind of singing together. Anyway, so that was my upbringing. Then when I was 16, I went abroad to Thailand on an exchange program for a year. And I was bathed in this culture that was deeply Buddhist. And so I think it was a transformative time for me as a young kind of 16-year-old in general, personally. And it was just embedded in this sort of Buddhist tradition as well. And I came to really respect and understand some of that tradition. And when I came back, I found myself bouncing around. I end up in these Catholic institutions my whole life. I'm not Catholic, but by the way, I went to a Catholic high school, and then I went to Notre Dame, and now I'm teaching college at the Holy Cross. So I have some weird kind of karmic fate wrapped up with Catholicism. So I have been influenced by the Catholic tradition, and particularly here at Holy Cross, the Jesuit tradition, which I have a lot of regard for. But it's along the way, these moments in which I find myself attracted to these either kind of interdenominational or ecumenical or kind of pan-spiritual traditions. Those are many of the retreats I went on. And then the Zen Center. And Zen has often this very kind of open sense of how to accept other traditions and religions in some ways. But the other thing I would say that has been absolutely fundamental to me was when I was at Notre Dame and I was taking a course on nonviolence, I was introduced to the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. And later, I actually got the opportunity to teach in China for 10 weeks over the summer. And I taught my Chinese students, who, by the way, had never really heard of Lao Tzu or the Tao Te Ching. I taught them that, and it was such a bizarre experience. Anyway, once I discovered it in graduate school, I was so taken by, I think it was Stephen Mitchell's translation of the Tao, that I required it for every class I taught while I was at UC Boulder. Every class, wouldn't matter what the subject matter was. I required the Tao Te Ching, and we would always use it as a reference point because it was such a wonderful way of both getting critical thinking integrated into the classroom and having people think in ways that sort of turned all of their notions upside down, which I think is invaluable for thinking creatively, is you have to break out of these standardized notions or assumptions about the subjects you're looking at, and you have to be able to turn them upside down and look at them upside down. And the Tao Te Ching was invaluable in doing that because it always took such great effort to sit and interpret and reinterpret and discuss exactly what was going on, how we can make meaning out of this thing that is over 1,000 years old in the modern context. And so that, I think, and that sort of simplicity and that creativity and so forth, I think to this day has influenced my own work because I'm drawn to the creative, I'm drawn to the simple, the imaginative, and the practical, right? Because I want it to be something I can put in my pocket, which again was the Tao Te Ching. It was something I could stick in my pocket and I could walk around with and pull it out and read a passage and think about it. And so those things I think really help shape this journey for me.
Oh, that's so interesting. That makes a lot of sense hearing you say that, actually. Yeah, wow, what an extraordinary text.
Yeah, it's really one of my goals someday to write my own interpretation. I know everyone has done it. There's
That would be great.
100 translations of the Tao, but it's one of those bucket lists.
Well, you have a great way of explaining things. That seems like a great idea because it's a very elusive text too. Like it seems so straightforward, but then there's something about the Tao Te Ching too that it's interesting you're bringing that up because we focus so much on the earth and being better stewards of the earth throughout the episodes. And I've always felt like the Tao Te Ching, that very earth-based connection. Maybe it's the idea of everything comes from the Tao and returns to the Tao. And that makes me think so much in Christianity, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and just our connection to the earth. We are of the earth.
Yeah, I mean, it just reminds me, you're right, that the Tao Te Ching is so steeped in just like having us return to our source, right? And to think about that source. The other thing, I don't know if I think of it as quite spiritual, but I don't know if other people ever had this experience. There was a time, I think in the 80s, National Geographic, the magazine was out, and every now and then they would slip in a little poster in the middle part of the magazine. And one year I opened up the little poster and it was a map of the known universe.
Oh my gosh.
And it was so mind-blowing. I had to hang it up on my wall, and it was up there, and I brought it to college, and it was all tattered. And to this day, this map sticks with me. And this idea that humans, as limited as we are and as how many problems and challenges we face, that we have a sense of at least as far as we can see in the universe, which is incredibly far. I mean, galaxy clusters and superclusters. It's mind-blowing. And every time I feel like I'm getting caught up in a cycle of hopelessness, I will come back to that kind of map and see how tiny the Earth is on that map. Oh. It's such a like speck within a speck within a speck in that known universe. And it just brings me into a space where I feel like, yeah, this is doable. Yeah, I can do this.
Puts things in perspective very quickly.
Exactly.
That's beautiful. I love National Geographic growing up too. My grandfather got me a subscription to my brother and I. So yeah, I know it's just the fascination with their graphics. And that sounds like an amazing map. Well, thank you, Ellis. This has been so thought-provoking, and you're such a wellspring of knowledge, and you're such a great teacher. So thank you. As we do wrap it up, I normally, and I know you've already offered so much, but I ask guests to end with an offering if they have any kind of information that they want to share further.
You know what actually sticks out now that we talked about the Tao, I will offer this.
Okay.
There is a passage in the Tao about water that has always stuck with me. It was the first passage that was ever interpreted for me by the professor that introduced me to the Tao Te Ching. And let me see if I can find it here. I think it goes like this. Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water. Yet for dissolving the hard and inflexible, nothing can surpass it. The soft overcomes the hard. The gentle overcomes the rigid. Everyone knows this is true, but few can put it into practice. And I think for me that is it's about soft power. It's about the power of us as people. And when we look at these enormous institutions, the trouble with our political systems and the corporations that we may be up against, or how media is spiraling out of control, it looks like such a powerful and inordinate challenge.
Yeah.
And what we have to offer is so much softer. We have our voices and we have each other and we have our collective votes, and they seem so small. And yet it's like water, right? Water will wear away anything given time. And so I think it's what we should focus on.
Thank you for sharing that. This has been great, and thank you for your time today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Erin. It's a real pleasure to talk to you.
I will post links to the guides and apps Ellis has created in the show notes and on the episode webpage at earthrisingpodcast.com. Thank you for listening in, and I welcome your feedback and questions if you want to email me at erin@earthrisingpodcast.com. Until next time, take care and be well.